Oh, oh.
There's a few places in the video where you got interference. We already figured it out, so you only have to move a little bit to the left, to the right, in front, and just let that place be. Yeah. 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 ¿Tú vas a hacer introducción?
Sí.
Avísame cuando estés lista para comenzar transmisión.
Perfecto.
¿No comienzas?
Oh. 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 Oh.
Yep, you're good.
It's good? No, but why?
There you are. Oh, yeah. Same thing. We're like, there's no audio. And then others is like, zoop.
Oh. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the ICCI Pavilion. ICCI is the International Climate and Cryosphere Initiative, and we are sharing this pavilion with Ambition of Melting Ice, co-chairs Chile and Iceland. So we are getting started. This event will focus on the International Year of Glaciers Preservation, Decade Cryosphere. And I will first introduce you to Mr. Pam Pearson, Director of the ICCI, member of the International Year of Glaciers Preservation Advisory Board, Task Force 4 Chair. So Pam, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And my name again is Pam Pearson. I'm the director of the International Cryospheric Climate Initiative, but in this particular context, I'm also the chair of one of the 4 task forces of the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. And you'll hear a bit more about that from Susanna, who is my vice chair, a little bit later, as well as Miriam Jackson, who is the vice chair of the Outreach and Communications Task Force 1. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the proper slide. Can I have the second slide, please? Okay. Good. The UN General Assembly approved an International Year for Glaciers Preservation a couple of years ago. And this is actually not a new effort. It was actually 2 years in the making, even though we're towards the end of the year right now. It was an initiative of the government of Tajikistan, who we'll hear from in a moment, because they've been very much leading on glaciers also in this context for many years now Tajikistan actually had a Glaciers pavilion last year in Baku that maybe some of you visited. And it's because of these impacts, not just on glaciated regions, but the downstream regions. Next slide, please. And so it's to raise global awareness, best practices and knowledge, and really a coordination mechanism co-led by the World Meteorological Association organization and UNESCO, which has a very strong educational component, but really involving researchers and efforts around the world. As you'll hear in a little bit, the Dushanbe Glaciers Conference, for example, had a huge representation from countries of sub-Saharan Africa because they've understood that this affects them as well. So it's a coordination mechanism led by an advisory board that is chaired by John Pomeroy of Canada and Carolina Adler of Chile, actually, and Switzerland. And we've met really pretty much once a month for the past 12 months. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So some of the major IYGP events, there was a launch at WOMO in Geneva in January. On March 21st, there was the first International Glaciers Day with a very large event at the UN in New York, as well as at UNESCO Paris, plus local and virtual events that have occurred pretty much worldwide throughout the year. And then the big event was the May 29th, 31st, really going on to June 1st with field trips, International Glaciers Conference in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, with several thousand participants from Tajikistan and around the world. Other major events were the Sagarmatha Sambad in Kathmandu earlier in May, at UNGA Climate Week in September. Here at COP30, of course, there have been several related events, and there will be an event in Unea as well. Next slide, please. But the IYGP was really just the beginning, because this year also marks the start of the Decade of Action on Cryospheric Sciences. And this is another initiative of Tajikistan, but this time together with the government of France. Next slide, please. And it's focused on all cryosphere, so not just mountain cryosphere like IYGP in terms of glaciers, mountain permafrost, and snowpack, but also ice sheets, sea ice, river and lake ice, and seasonally frozen ground, which doesn't always get as much attention, but a lot of severe events and economic impacts actually come from frozen ground that is not permafrost, letting loose on slopes and really causing major downstream damage. You'll see some of that shortly. And then there is some impact on sea level rise as well from glaciers, but from ice sheets, of course, is much greater. If all the glaciers in the world melted, there would be about half a meter of additional sea level rise. We're looking at over 60 meters of sea level rise if both ice sheets melt. Next slide, please. So this was approved by the General Assembly earlier this year. This one is led solely by UNESCO. It is still under design. Many of us will be gathering in Paris later this year. And if you want to get involved in this decade of action, you would be most welcome, whether you're a researcher, a local person, or someone who is impacted by cryosphere, even if it's far away. Next slide, please. So the decade also coincides with the International Polar Year. And I can't emphasize how important these years are. The last one was in 2007-09, and it really fed into the Paris Agreement, and we're still benefiting today from IPY and the science that was started then and funded then, especially in terms of ice sheets and sea level rise in our polar oceans. And so this is something that will end the decade. And in the meantime, many, many planning events and ways to bring this cryosphere message to the entire planet. Next slide, please. So it is my distinct honor right now to have a glaciologist from Tajikistan talk about the glaciers and some of the impacts in his country, as well as the Dushanbe Conference. This is Kamoluddin Narizoda, who is with the Glacier Council that is part of the Hydromet. He also supports to a great extent the Environment Ministry or Council on Environmental Protection in Tajikistan. But the Hydromet group is extremely strong and is here as well. And we appreciate him coming because they actually had another event right now. And so thank you for making some time for us today.
Thank you very much, Pam. And how Pam said, my name is Kamoluddin Nazir Zoda, Deputy Head of Center of the Glaciers Agency for Hydrometeorology in Tajikistan. And right now I will present you the glacier agenda and the outcomes from the high-level international conference for glacier preservation 2025. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I will be presenting the glacier agenda and how I also said about it. So the event brought together representative of the governments, the scientific community and international organization to discuss urgent measures to protect glaciers, a key resource for the water and the climate security in our planet. So, as you know, Tajikistan is a predominantly mountainous country. 93% of our territory is occupied by high mountain ranges, including the Pamirs, Hisar, and Alay. The highest point in the peak is Moili Somon, 7,495 meters. This mountain system defends the extensive glaciers of the country, which plays a fundamental role in the hydrology in Central Asia. So, water has always played a critical role in the socio-economic development of the peoples of Central Asia. The rivers of the Aral Sea Basin generate more than 115 kilometers of cube of water resources annually, of which more 55% is formed within the territory of Tajikistan. As you can see, the volume of the glacier reservoirs is very big in our country, more than 845 kilometers of cube over the more than 8,000 kilometers of square the area. This makes glaciers a critical sources of the surface of the groundwater, influencing river flow in the Aral Sea Basin. So I will talk about our glaciers. Glaciers in Tajikistan represent the general part of the country's natural landscape and plays a key role in the providing water resources. And there are over 14,000 glaciers in territory of the Republic of Tajikistan, of which about 1,000 have disappeared over the past 50 years. The total area covered by the glaciers in the country is more 11,000 kilometers square, which corresponding to 8% of the territory of our Republic of Tajikistan. So the central Pamir is a key region with more than 1,500 glaciers. Changes according here have regional implications for a river runoff. According to the data from 2000 and 2018 showed there has been a significant reduction in the glaciers area and thickness with an average surface lowering of about 10 meters. These figures show that glaciers melt not only reduces the surface area but also decreases the total water volume stored as ice. However, and even more alarming constituents is the increasing frequency and the magnitude of the natural hazard. Activities the glacier melt driven by climate change leads to the formation and the repeat expansion of the glacier lakes, many of which pose a risk of outbursts. These processes increase the likelihood of floods, debris flow, and catastrophic intrusions in the mountain regions. In this context, the critical strengths of the monitoring at the level of individual basins and enhance data coordination among the countries of the region. But now I would like to show you another factor of the currently result to the glaciers. The factor is the phenomenon of the glacier surges and the unstable climatic conditions. Some glaciers are in the Pamir experience sharp. So they represent updated changes in the glacier dynamics. These events increase risk for population infrastructure and complicate the mountains and the forecasting of hazardous process. One such surge was recorded in September and October this year. And now our colleagues see how this glacier starts to surges again. For 2 weeks ago, this glacier started to move it to more than 300 meters. It's very dangerous and very interesting to scientific parts. For understanding all this situation in global area, given the global importance of these issues, Tajikistan initiated the declaration of 2025 as the International Year of Glacier Preservation. How Pam said it's also. The 77th UN General Assembly resolution officially proclaimed 2025 as the International Years of the Glacier Preservation. The government of Tajikistan generously hosted a conference reflecting global recording of the issues' significance and providing the opportunity to mobilize international attention and resources. So, the conference brought together more than 2,600 participants from 90 countries. 12 thematic sessions, 2 leader roundtables, 8 conference forums, and 11 side events, Glacier Festival and International Exhibition, learning tour the Glacier Run. It served as a broad platform for scientific, political, and published dialogues. So, in this highlights provided this presentation of the new scientific data on the glacier monitoring, exchange of best practice, raising awareness of the role of the glaciers in the biodiversity, water resources, and cultural heritage. Raising establishment of the partnerships and mobilization of political will. A call to increase funding for the glacier preservation. Outcome documents. The conference results in several measures. Some outcome documents. The first is the Dushanbe Declaration, the chair's summary, the official conference report, and the Dushanbe Glaciers appear, a call to action contained in initiatives and the financial community. These documents have already been submitted to the UN and are available in the 6 languages. They represent an important foundation for future steps. For these 3 documents, outcomes were calculated to the United Nations General Assembly 31st July 2025. And you also can find this document in the 6 languages also we said about it. So now a global glaciers agenda has these future plans. First, supporting the implementation of the International Year for Glacier Preservation and the Decade of the Cryosphere. Launching the Global Glaciers Agenda, establishing the Dushanbe process for the monitoring and the follow-up conference. Continuing the research mobilization and the thinking alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and dear colleagues, today I am pleased to outline the key steps that will shape our joint efforts in strengthening glacier research and the climate resilience in Tajikistan in the Central Asia region. First, we aim to establish of the regional coordination center of the cryosphere issues in the Dushanbe under the auspices of the World Meteorological Organization. Second, organization of an international scientific and expedition to the glaciers of Tajikistan. And finally, full restoration of the Garber of Meteo station on the Wanjak Fetchencho glaciers and its transformation into an international high mountain glaciological observatory. It's mean so for these big works I invite all of you to join this first for our expedition and contribute to its successful implementation. This modern about this station, this modern facility will become a new platform for the long-term monitoring and international scientific cooperation in the high mountains region. First, we start in our country in Central Asia. These steps reflect our shared commitment to advancing science, improving resilience, and the safeguarding the cryosphere for the future generation. So, it's my I end my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamaluddin, for your presentation. So now I'm going to introduce Dr. Miriam Jackson, Nordic and Eurasia Director of ICCI, Task Force 1 Deputy Chair. So please, Miriam, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to try and do this without the headphones on, which means I can't hear anything else going on. So, oops. Oh. Okay, so I'm going to talk mainly about Task Force 1. This is where I'm the deputy lead. And Task Force 1 is really looking at communications, publications, and this kind of thing in the internationally on glaciers preservation. And there's 4 task forces altogether. I've been involved in pretty much all of them to some extent, but obviously Task Force 1, where I'm the deputy lead, is the main one I'm involved in. So this is a global campaign for International Year of Glaciers Preservation. So really trying to work a lot with outreach and communications and make sure that we don't just do excellent work in 2025, but the people know about it, know what's going on, and can contribute if they want. The second task force is the conference that Kamaluddin already talked about, and also the regional activities, so regional workshops and capacity building, this kind of thing. And then the third one's on research and monitoring initiatives, and this one's also doing a lot in preparation for the decade on cryosphere action. And then finally we have the 4th task force, which is policy advocacy, partnerships and resource mobilization. And this is where Pam is a lead and Susanna is a deputy lead, so Susanna will tell you more about that one later. So Task Force 1, then, the global campaign for International Year of Glaciers Preservation. One of the first things we had, first of all, who we are. So it's a number of different organizations. We have a lot of scientists. We also have other people working with youth activists, or people working with youth, people working with school children, people working with indigenous people and some indigenous people. And so it's quite a mixed bunch actually in the task force. There's about 120 members from 70 countries, so I think we've covered pretty much all the countries where we have glaciers. And there's also some different subgroups that have been established so that we can concentrate on some things in more detail. There's one subgroup on social media, because this is a communications task force. There's one on policy communication, so developing policy briefs or issue briefs related to IYGP. And also one on youth strategy. So these are the key activities then. So basically outreach and global awareness, also working on key messages, and I'll get into that in a little bit more detail next. Also a coordinated social media strategy to try and make sure that we're getting information out there. policy, science, communications materials, that we also need to reach policy makers. So for example, policy makers here. So this has been one of the main focus of this task force, and also youth engagement strategy as well. And one of the activities they taught it was in intergenerational hikes to different glacier areas. So the key messages, we actually started working on these early last year. I think they were almost finished by May last year. So this is something we did about 1.5 years ago because we wanted to use these further. If you're not familiar with the key messages, I have put the URL up here so that you can have a look at the key messages in more detail, but I'll go over some of them briefly here. So the first one is that glaciers are critical to life. We don't really think of glaciers in relation to life, but there is a lot of life that is dependent on the glacier, dependent on the meltwater from the glacier. There's even life under the glacier, so this is the first key message. The second is that the sensitive indicators of climate change. And when we talk about climate change, we talk about trying to keep climate temperature increase to within 1.5 degrees. We talk about every 10th of a degree being important. We talk about increase in carbon dioxide levels. But these are things that we don't really see, we don't really feel. We can't tell the difference in 1/10 of a degree. So basically this is, what we can do is we can look at glaciers and see that glaciers are changing, and this is a very good indication that climate is changing. So glaciers are actually very useful tools when we're talking about climate change. Another thing is also how critical melting snow and ice from the mountains are for fresh water supply. So many areas of the world, and I know for example in Central Asia, it's very dry, and a lot of communities are very dependent on meltwater from snow and ice for agriculture, for irrigation, or for drinking water, for hydropower, and especially if you have a hot, dry summer, there's very little water, and that's when you get more melting from glaciers, and that's when they're really important. So even in areas where it's not a big proportion of the total fresh water resources that people use, it can be very important at certain times of the year. Another one is that as the glaciers melt and the permafrost thaws, there's actually new hazards, or hazards are becoming greater. You might get hazards popping up in areas that didn't have them before. So this is another message that there's actually hazards related to the change. Also that perhaps one of the most important things is when we talk about glaciers preservation, how do we do that? So we need to reduce greenhouse gases. This is how we preserve glaciers. There's other work going on putting plastic on glaciers, things like that. These are not, using more plastic is not the way to go. We really need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to preserve the glaciers. Another one is that glacier monitoring is very important, and Kamaladen also talked about that we really need to know what the glaciers are doing. If we're going to adapt properly, we need to know what we're adapting to, how quickly we have to adapt. We have to know about glaciers for mitigation strategies. For us, glacier monitoring is extremely important. And it's also not enough. We have some, but it's often hard to continue the measurements, so glacier monitoring is vitally important. And here's some of the more. Glaciers are important for livelihoods, deglaciation's causing problems. We need to involve youth, because youth are the ones who are going to be most affected by glacier change. There's also a cultural and spiritual significance. We find this in pretty much all parts of the world that have glacier and snow cover. Some people might express it in a religious way, others not so religious way, but it is culturally very important to many people. It's also a testimony of the Earth's history. We can use the ice deep in old glaciers to tell us how the climate was before. Also, as glaciers shrink, we get new post-glacial landscapes, we can get ecosystems evolving. And also, as glaciers vanish, it's having an effect on mountain tourism. And often mountain tourism is very important areas where there's not much economic activity. So another aspect of Task Force 1 is social media. We have a Trello board where we have different tools that can be used. So instead of having to start from scratch every time, we have a few tools available that people can use, and these are open to everybody. For example, quote cards, things like this. And one activity that we had especially with youth engagement was under something called SATI, Sustainable Alpine Tourism Initiative. This was started by a woman called Sarisha, who was actually here at COP. She just left yesterday, I think. And one of the things she did was to have, first of all, to show a film that she'd been working on, And this was shown at the different glacier hikes. And then have intergenerational hikes. You have youth and different generations having a hike in a glacier landscape and talking about the glaciers and glacier change. So there were several different hikes. There's one in Italy, there's one in Monterrey Glacier. In Chamonix, the glacier hike was also in relation with the Letters to the Earth glacier workshop. So people writing to the Earth about how they feel about these changes and how they feel about glacier change. There's also one in Norway in Jostedalsbreen, a Nigasbreen glacier I was involved in, and also a follow-up one during the International Mountain Conference in Austria. And here's some photos from the hike. We had, you can see who was on the hike. We also had a few more people joining us for the film show as well in the discussion afterwards. And this is Sarisha on the right-hand side. And I'm just showing this photo. This is basically looking down the valley, and in the bottom you can see the glacier lake. And actually I've been working on this glacier now for over 20 years. And when I first started working on the glacier, I think my first visit was 1999, and the glacier went all the way down to the lake. So in that time, 26 years, there's been 703 meters of glacier retreat. So you can see these glaciers really are changing rapidly. And this is where we showed the film. Obviously we had the screens closed for the film, but it was a really nice view, and you can just see the glacier there in the background. So it was nice to give us a focus as we talked about glacier change. Another thing we've been working on is, as I mentioned, policy briefs and issue briefs. It's no point in doing the work if we don't tell people, especially policymakers, what are we doing and why are we doing it. So developing information briefs for policymakers has been an important part of Task Force 1. The first policy brief we released on the 21st of January in Geneva. This was when actually IYGP was officially launched. So we had just a 2-pager here giving information about what was going on, why IYGP was happening, why glaciers are important, and also why emissions and lowering emissions is very important. There was another policy brief released in Paris in March, and this was during the actual Glacier Day. This was really looking at Andean water towers, and the important thing was this was done in English and in Spanish. I do have the URLs here, a lot of useful information if you want to have a look. If the URLs, I hope you can still hear me over the rain. If the URL's too long, if you look at Antarctic glaciers, it's Antarctic glaciers, but it's now actually about many different glaciers in all parts of the world. That'll give you a link to the URL. We've also had a few more policy briefs. There was one actually released earlier today. This is looking at glaciers and youth, and this was released in an activity together with a school in Belém, and we have a few more being developed. We'll have a couple that will be released for International Mountain Day as well. So several policy briefs have been developed or are going to be released by the end of the year. So these are some of the events that took place, and Pam's already mentioned, actually this one wasn't mentioned already. So for things to happen during 2025, we had to plan before 2025. As I mentioned, we worked on the key messages, but we also had a brainstorming in Paris at UNESCO headquarters in July last year. And this was looking basically the themes that were developed into the different task forces and what people could be working on. So here I am and Daniil Mishra, Michael Zemp, who's the director of WGMS, Sulagna from Duramlo, Korn Verbis from UNESCO as well. And then we actually had the launch of IYGP at the WMO headquarters in Geneva in January. And although the Glacier Day was in March, we didn't want to wait a quarter into the year before we launched it, so we had the launch in January. And then we had the first World Glacier Day, and at UNESCO headquarters again in Paris, we have the two co-chairs here, John Pomeroy, Carolina Adler, and also I think this is the Education and Science Minister from Tajikistan who was present. And at the same time in New York there was a parallel event as well, and Susanna and Pam were there. We also had the chance to meet up with colleagues, and the day before the Glacier Day we actually had a brainstorming session on the decade for Cryosphere action. So these are some of the things we've been working on in Task Force 1, and let me know afterwards if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mian Jackson, for your presentation. So I'm gonna now introduce you to Dr. Susanna Hancock, Global Mountain Director of ICCI and Task Force 4 Deputy Chair. So Susanna, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our activities with Task Force 4. So as was said, I, along with Pam, have been heading this up. She's been the director of Task Force 4, and I've been her deputy director. But Task Force 4 focuses on policy advocacy, partnerships, and mobilizing financing and resources. So I'll just go over some of the brief goals of Task Force 4. I won't read this all, but effectively we are looking to integrate glacier preservation into all levels of climate strategy, from the regional, national, and international, as well as into disaster risk management plans around the world. We aim to forge partnerships with international organizations, national organizations, private sector, academia, so that we can figure out how we can get this expertise and the funding in for glaciers preservation. We also aim to link different global inter-organizations, such as data centers and monitoring systems that work on the cryosphere and glaciers and specifically. I can't hear myself over the rain and thunder right now. Establishing plans for reducing the carbon footprint of scientists. So as scientists, when we're doing research in these areas, we want to limit and mitigate how much we're contributing towards their very melt. We also aim to develop collaborations on funding and resource mobilization amongst governments and international organizations, as well as the private sector and philanthropic entities. Secure dedicated funding for glacier monitoring programs, research, and capacity building. And then target climate finance to support adaptation schemes. And I'll talk a little bit about some of these in a moment. So this is just an example. I'll try the. Okay, now I can actually hear myself. That's exciting. Thank you, Aileen. So this is just an example right here of what happens when we have these glacier disasters. We have here a hydropower plant, and a GLOF, glacial lake outburst flood, came through and has destroyed this. So not only is this investments that were lost, and therefore also needed to be redeveloped because this obviously was unable to complete its operational lifespan, but also we run into the risks downstream as well. Somebody spoke to me the other day when we were talking about the financing for some of these. They were thinking that hydro plants, the issues with them is you can get too much rain or too much flow and they can overflow, or you get not enough and then they run dry. But adding in the glaciers element, you add a completely different element to that, which is the entire thing could disappear and it could cause disasters for people down below. So here we can just see what some of these GLOFs look like a little bit. So we're seeing as we're running down the Tista River to the dam, and it's causing impacts down below. All right, so I just want to talk a little bit about the impact of glaciers and their importance. This is just showing the amount of ice that remains in different regions of the world at different levels of temperature. And when I'm talking temperature here, I'm looking at where temperatures are stabilizing. So this isn't saying 1.5 degrees by 2100 or something. This is if we were to stabilize the temperature at 1.5 degrees, we can see that in places like Scandinavia and the western United States and Canada, we may only have 20% of ice remaining. And that's going to go to basically zero if we get on our current trajectories. We know that adhering to a 1.5 degree temperature saves approximately 54%, so just over half of ice that we would otherwise lose on a current policy aligned 2.7 degrees or so. If we look at the bigger areas of ice right now, we can still see that in sort of places like the Karakoram, which traditionally until recently had been seen as an area gaining mass, that we're going to lose 70% of that at a 3-degree temperature, which is not far off from where we are. So we're still losing ice significantly in these bigger areas. This is Vantyak Glacier in Tajikistan, and it was very well monitored, and currently, as was just mentioned earlier a little bit about this glacier, it is one that they're rebuilding the monitoring systems for. But I'm just going to show through a few slides of this right now, showing the difference in this glacier between a very low emission scenario and a very high emission scenario, just so we can see how much ice actually is saved. You know, today they look obviously very similar, and in 25 years there isn't too much difference. But as we progress 2070, we can see that we start to lose significantly more ice under a high emission scenario, and even more ice as we get to the end of the century. So I want to talk about two aspects of our policy task force. As mentioned, there are several goals that I introduced earlier, but where we come in with ICCI, the first talk about the ambition on melting ice, high-level group on sea level rise and mountain water resources. This is a group that was founded actually in 2022, with just before the official resolution to establish 2025 as the International Year in Glaciers Preservation. It's currently chaired by 2 glaciated countries, Chile and Iceland, but it currently has 25 total member states. And if you look at these member states, you'll see that some of them are glaciated and some of them are very, very, very far removed geographically from glaciers. So we've got Palau, Vanuatu, Samoa, as well as Austria and Switzerland, Nepal. So it's a big mixture of states, and that's because when we talk about glaciers, we're really talking about what we call sort of from the source to the sea. So just a little bit of where we're working with policy. Glaciers have traditionally been seen as this early indicator of climate change. The impacts globally began to be raised in AR5, so the IPCC 5th assessment report in 2013, and in SROC in 2019. So that's the special report on oceans and cryo. However, today, 2025, we're still associating cryosphere with glaciers and with those the polar ice sheets and the mountain impacts. We're not seeing those downstream effects. We're not seeing this as something that really affects many of the countries of the world. What we're aiming to do on the policy side is saying we're not just talking about shifts within the cryosphere, we're talking about shifts from the cryosphere to globally. And we're looking at changes that are basically irreversible on human timescales. So what we're seeing, these directions, that ice loss that I just showed a moment ago, there are studies that show that may be able to regrow, but it's not going to change in our lifespans. And this really goes to show that because of this irreversibility and this permeance, the best thing we can do for glacier preservation is that preservation, and that's mitigation, keeping emissions as low as possible. So we host ministerials and head of state government level events. So we have here at the Cryosphere Pavilion with Prince Albert II of Monaco, and this other event here, President Macron of France. This is at the One Planet Polar Summit. So just talking a little bit about the progress and challenges in some of these recent negotiations. Glasgow, this is just going to run through the last 5 COPs. We had the first inclusion of the cryosphere in the cover decision at Glasgow. And most important that came out of that was the emphasis of 1.5 degrees over the 2 degrees. That sort of higher limit set in the Paris Agreement. But 1.5, even that, is not a safe limit for the cryosphere. But huge, huge difference, as I showed a moment ago, with those different scenarios. COP27 in Egypt. The first inclusion of cryosphere concerns in the operational text under section Science and Urgency. Held on to that 1.5 from Glasgow, although barely. And we started to get the cryosphere into other negotiation tracks. COP28, this was in Dubai. And here we also had that first global stocktake. Again, barely held that line on 1.5 versus 2 degrees. But we did get governments and media to start paying attention and understanding the importance globally of the cryosphere. Loss and damage was a big topic there, and it did reference slow onset events, which is about the loss of the cryosphere and melting ice, both from the ice sheets and the glaciers. COP29 last year. Very challenging for us to bring cryosphere in, given the overall focus on the finance last year. Did look initially like we were going to get some good text in RSO, so that's really the main science track of all these negotiations, but it was pushed out at the very, very last minute. And then here we are at COP30 in Belém. And one of the big focuses here, obviously being in Amazonia, is that 1.5 threshold, because the Amazonas is an area that is very, very sensitive to this lower degree temperature as well. So trying to make that parallel. And it also marks the finalization of the next round of nationally determined contributions. So this is just an example of some of the pushback that we're getting in these negotiation texts. This is from the Research and Systematic Observation negotiating track from last year, SB 62 in Bonn. So I don't need to be able to read all of this, but I'm just going to highlight what was in the draft. And it said the substat noted with alarm and utmost concern the state of the climate system. And that translated to, eventually in the final version, it noted the information. So we can see that that urgency and alarm has been removed. Another example in the same text, ocean heat, current, and sea levels reached the highest on record. The Arctic and Antarctic sea ice extent were below average, with increasing glacier mass loss and that extreme events. And that went to both slow onset and extreme events. So those of us who work in this area recognize that as cryosphere, but for many people who are not familiar with the cryosphere, that meaning is lost. Another example, every increment of warming translated just to global warming. And this mention of the temperature goal, to say that global warming remains below 1.5 and therefore below the Paris Agreement goal, made it into a footnote. The estimate is below a level of global warming at 1.5, but given the uncertainty ranges, the possibility that we have exceeded 1.5 cannot be ruled out. So this is just an example of how we're trying to, what we're trying to get in and some of the challenges and the pushbacks of how these texts end up getting negotiated, because we're working on a consensus model here. So we have, and I have a few available, you can actually almost see the URL, should have put that a little bit more larger here, but education, publications, and media, one of our big things here is to make sure that this information is available and accessible to the policymakers, to those who are making decisions. How can we translate text that we as scientists discuss, but how can we make that relevant to those who are actually calling the shots? The URL is icccinet.org/state-cryo25, or you can go to the webpage iccci.net.org and access the text from there. But this covers 5 different dynamics of the cryosphere. So this is just one example of our work. But the overall goal, being one of physics, we cannot negotiate with the melting point of ice. So with this group, AMI, one of our things is to bring negotiators to the cryosphere so that they really understand what it is that we want them to be able to discuss, and for them to be able to make these connections and make them very personally. So here is a trip, I believe, from 2019. And what we're seeing here is, again, very similar to what Miriam was talking about the glacier loss over 20 years. Here's another 20-year show. This is where the glacier extended 20 years ago, or 20 years before. And here, this is where the glacier terminus was 20 years before, and it's there now. So we can see that end of the lake, where after the lake, that's where it was. Or that's where sort of we're getting now. All right, so as part of our declaration, I'll just read this small excerpt. And that's: protecting the cryosphere through vigorous climate action is not a matter of mountain and polar nations alone. It is a matter of urgent global concern because the greatest impacts on human communities lie well outside these regions. I will skip over some more literature here, but these slides will be available afterward. Basically saying that we need to mitigate, we need that 1.5, and that we are concerned about the fact that current policies can easily lead to the loss of 75% of ice worldwide, with many countries, many regions losing all or nearly all of their ice at even 2 degrees. So our second aspect of this, and the second thing that I'm going to emphasize here, is a little bit on financing. Why does glacier-related finance need to happen? And this is just a cross-section of some of the disasters that we're seeing. I mentioned a little bit with the GLOF earlier that it's not just the hydro dams, we're not just seeing too much water, not enough water, we're seeing the loss of the project completely. And Miriam as well spoke a little bit about this entire task force as well. But we're seeing concurrent issues and multi-hazards: the unstable slopes and landslides, avalanches, floods, social and infrastructure systems, thawing permafrost, etc. And these are happening at the same time, or back to back, to the degree that areas people may be having too much water and flood, but also needing to be able to prepare for a future without. So, key barriers to glacier-related developments. Many people who work in financial spheres elsewhere will find many of these challenges very familiar. We also experience challenges to access funding, political standstills, desire for increased transparency, the separation of climate and finance ministries so that we're not talking the same language, or we're siloed, we don't understand what the other needs. In unfamiliar metrics, so nature-based solutions, for example, as we relate them to glaciers, many of the regulatory frameworks for these actually predate the development of some of the nature-based solutions, so that funders don't actually know how to incorporate these solutions. They're seen as too risky. But we have specific ones for glaciers that go beyond the general climate sphere. As I mentioned a moment ago, we have these episodic nature of catastrophes, glacier-related extreme events, so that's such as those GLOFs, but they're also concurrent disasters. They affect communities and the landscape on multiple levels. We lack data on physical climate risks, and that's that some of these glaciers are very hard to access, very expensive to access, geopolitically challenging as well. Economic impact assessments, the pipeline of bankable projects, policy and regulatory clarity, financial risk metrics and tools, community-level indigenous knowledge integration, competing disasters with capacity and urgency. So this means, for example, many of these disasters are happening in areas where they're already experiencing another kind of catastrophe existentially. So that could be poverty, it could be food or water, political instability. And that just means that glaciers, because it's not seen as a risk until it really overflows and it becomes a catastrophe, it doesn't necessarily get the attention with these other competing disasters. And the fact that glacier issues are really transboundary. So I'm not going to go into these more specifically, except I will accept in a moment, I guess. So this here, when it loads, is just going to show an example of a developed country, Switzerland, which had been monitoring a glacial area in the Valais region of Switzerland, been monitoring for about 10 years, expecting to have a glacial collapse. And it did last May. It was able to evacuate nearly everybody, well, everybody initially, and then all the agricultural and animals. This was one that was a glacial collapse that accumulated due to rock piling on. And they were able to, it was, given a small community, they were able to get everybody out. There was somebody who was killed in a expanded region. But this is what the community looked like before, and there's just a hotel and a church, just to landmark a couple areas. The collapse happened, and that's what it looked like afterward. And to show that this is what happened in a place that is well monitored, was able to evacuate everybody, and was a small community. So you can imagine in places that we don't understand and we don't know, we have these same risks, but we don't get that warning. We don't know that there's necessarily a risk, and the results are infinitely more catastrophic. So one of the other issues that we look at are mountains as suppliers of water. And we have what we call peak water, and that is with events such as rain instead of snow, or rain on snow, and more rapid melt. We end up at the beginning of the season with too much water, and it gradually with less water and becoming a increased reduction in water. And this means that water is not where it's needed. So we have a mistiming of the water availability with, say, the harvest. And this could be initially too much water, and then drought, gradually leading to less and less water. Here we have, this is in Pakistan. This was a monsoonal rain, and then concurrently some increased glacier melt. Led to some pretty extensive flooding that covered a significant percentage of the country and led to great loss of life. So to expedite funding, these are just a couple key findings. We need improved economic analyses for resources, revised cost-benefit analyses mechanisms that account for glaciers. So this just means when we're talking with funders, especially with private funders, they want to know how much something is worth financially. How do we put a price tag on something like a glacier? How can we say, if we put a price tag on it, how much does it depreciate over time? But glaciers don't do that. So we're looking at, what is the value of the water? What is the value of the air? So we need a renewed CBA mechanism. Markets need to be shaped within. So for governments, for example, the Sustainable Capital Market Insurance, increased intersectoral and interministerial collaboration to meet the needs of the cryosphere. So that's, again, the environmental ministers understanding what the finance people need, and having the finance people, say, work with the environmental ministers. This is something that some of the development banks have recently started doing with a lot more success. And then deepen ties from financial institutions to communities. So this has come together, oh yes, and then glaciers, we see it again still as this niche issue, but it impacts 85% of the countries that are currently here at COP. There's 194 countries that are represented here. And then without urgent action on these barriers, many mountain and downstream communities are moving beyond those limits of adaptation and into the sphere of loss and damage. So this has been a paper that we have pulled together, a white paper, which is about to be published, and the webpage for that, iccinet.org/glaciersfinance, if you're interested in seeing some of that follow-up work. And again, the ICCI.org, you can go to that, and then you can access that State of the Cryosphere report that I mentioned earlier. And I'm just going to leave this up here for a moment. These are all the fantastic organizations and people that helped us pull this together. And with that, I will thank you very much. That's 2 areas of our work with Task Force 4.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for your presentation. And yes, I would like to thank all the participants for your 19 presentations on behalf of ICCI. But before concluding this event, I would like to make an announcement that we are having a Cryosphere quiz today at 6:30 in our pavilion. So you are all welcome to join us, and you don't have to be an ice expert to guess some of the answers of the quiz. Please, thanks again to the audience and the participants, and good afternoon to all.